The knock came just 20 minutes after Ezra slid the last box into his uncle's old cabin. He expected a welcome, maybe a curious neighbor. Instead, four strangers in navy blazers marched across his porch, clipboards in hand, and one of them snapped, "You've got 72 hours to leave this property. HOA rules." Ezra raised an eyebrow. "Funny," he said, "because I own this mountain. You just don't know it yet." The knock came just 20 minutes after Ezra Whitlock slid the last box into the corner of his uncle's old cabin. Dust still danced in the sunlight streaking through the cracked windows. He hadn't even had time to open a beer or sit down on the creaky sofa. He thought it might be a neighbor. Maybe someone bringing pie or wanting to ask about his arrival. Instead, he was met with the sharp sound of SUV doors slamming and four people in matching navy blazers marching up the gravel path like they owned it. The lead man, tall with a buzz cut and clipboard, didn't bother to introduce himself. "You've got 72 hours to vacate this property," he barked. "Windmere Preservation Society Code 7B prohibits unauthorized dwellings on conservation-designated land." Ezra blinked. "Excuse me?" "You're not allowed to live here," the woman beside him said coldly. "Cabin or not. This land is under HOA jurisdiction, and no residency is permitted past the lake perimeter." Ezra folded his arms. He was still in his worn hoodie and cargo pants, still smelled like storage boxes and old pine. "This was my uncle's place. He passed away. I inherited it. I have the deed." "You have a claim, not a right," the third man said, a smug smirk spreading across his face. "And if you resist, the fines start at $1,500 per day. Consider this your official notice." Ezra stepped aside and let them see the interior of the cabin. Nothing but old furniture, unpacked boxes, and dust. "Does this look like a commercial venture to you? I'm not building a resort. I'm just living in what my family owned for decades." The man with the clipboard didn't even glance inside. He placed a yellow notice on the door, turned on his heel, and led the group back to their black SUVs. Ezra stood there for a long moment, heart thudding, not with fear, but recognition. He'd seen this before, not in the woods, but in boardrooms, in corporate conference calls. A smiling lie backed by power, paperwork, and pressure. Something in him, something he hadn't felt since his consulting days, clicked on like a switch. Later that night, Ezra sat on the back porch with a mug of lukewarm tea and stared out at Windmere Lake. A breeze rustled the tall grass. Somewhere nearby, an owl called out. In the quiet, he could hear the words again. "You have 72 hours to leave." He opened his laptop, connected to the satellite hotspot, and began digging into county records. He hadn't planned on this. He just wanted peace. A break from the chaos of New York life. But they made a mistake. They came at him with rules, threats, and arrogance. And they didn't know who they were dealing with. Ezra barely slept that night. His mind raced with every piece of legal jargon thrown at him, every smug look on the faces of those HOA agents. By morning, the anger had cooled into focus. He wasn't some naive newcomer. They had no idea who he was. Ezra had spent over a decade consulting on cybersecurity and legal loopholes for high-stakes mergers. He'd seen companies buried because someone like him followed the right digital thread. And now he was going to follow one here. He started with the basics. Using the cabin's coordinates, he pulled up the Windmere County GIS map and zoning data. The first thing that stood out, the parcel his cabin sat on wasn't listed as conservation land. In fact, it had its own residential parcel number, deeded in 1957 to Lester Whitlock, his uncle. It was marked as private residential, no restrictions. No HOA mention, no encumbrances, no easements. Next, he looked up the so-called Windmere Preservation Society. No corporate entity under that name was registered with the state. There was, however, a nonprofit that had been dissolved 5 years ago for failure to file taxes. Yet they were operating, collecting dues, issuing fines, and making legal threats. Illegal threats. Ezra narrowed his eyes. He dug further. The HOA had a shiny website, slick branding, and a board of directors listed with fancy titles: President, Vice President, Chief Compliance Officer. Garland Thorne was listed as the president, the same clipboard-carrying man from the day before. But none of them had professional licenses, business registrations, or even contact numbers beyond a shared P.O. box in the town of Eastridge. By the afternoon, Ezra had uncovered something far more disturbing. Over the last 5 years, at least a dozen properties near Windmere Lake had changed ownership. Each one sold under value, often right after compliance violations were issued by the HOA. Families had moved out quickly, often within weeks of getting notices. And the buyers, all of them traced back to one parent company, North Trident Holdings, a shell company based out of Delaware. Ezra leaned back in his chair, breath slow. He had seen this kind of move before. Intimidation, followed by acquisition. It was an old playbook. Use fear to pressure owners, then flip the land for massive profit under the guise of community standards. He scribbled names down in a notebook: property owners, fake violations, closing dates, sale prices. Then he wrote 2 words across the top of the page in bold letters: land grab. As he looked out the window at the golden glow of dusk over the lake, something inside him stirred, something deeper than outrage. These weren't just legal games. This was theft, masked as neighborly policy. And they had made one crucial mistake. They thought he was alone. But Ezra had connections, quiet, powerful ones. And more importantly, he had the truth. All he needed now was one crack in their foundation. He grabbed his phone and called Maura Fenley. "Hey," he said when she picked up. "Remember that favor you owe me from the Starlight breach case?" There was a pause on the other end. "I remember. What's going on?" "I need you to help me burn down an HOA legally." He heard her chuckle, then say, "Send me everything." As the stars rose over Timberfall Ridge, Ezra felt the first calm breath return to his chest. The wolves had circled, but they didn't know the forest belonged to him. By the time the weekend arrived, Ezra had filled 2 entire legal pads with diagrams, timelines, and property histories. He mapped every transaction, every shady citation the HOA had issued, and every fake violation that coincided with a forced sale. A pattern emerged: fear, pressure, silence, then acquisition. What had once been a peaceful, rugged lakefront community was now a half-vacant playground for developers hiding behind rules no one voted on. Maura called on Sunday afternoon. Her voice was sharp, focused. Ezra could hear her typing in the background. "Okay," she said. "This Windmere Preservation Society is a joke. It's not a registered HOA. It's not even a legal nonprofit. They're using the old name from a dissolved entity to operate in the shadows." Ezra nodded, jotting her words down. "I figured. What about North Trident Holdings?" "That's where things get interesting," Maura continued. "North Trident is a Delaware-based holding company. Typical structure if you want to stay invisible. But the trustee who manages the real estate fund tied to it is you." Ezra froze. "What?" "Your uncle set it up in 2009. A trust called the Windmere Stewardship Fund. It owns over 70% of the land around the lake. Parcels that were supposed to remain untouched for conservation. You're the sole beneficiary and trustee now." Ezra leaned back slowly in his chair, stunned. The inheritance he'd assumed was just the cabin was actually an empire. A quiet, intentional empire. One his uncle must have built brick by brick over decades, buying back the land the HOA couldn't reach, protecting it from commercial destruction. "But," Maura added, "it looks like someone accessed the trust's holdings and started selling off land without your signature. My guess? Forged documents." Ezra's grip tightened around the pen in his hand. "They've been using my own land to threaten me," Maura exhaled. "Exactly. They don't know you're the legal owner of most of Windmere Ridge. They think you're just another out-of-towner to bully off the map." Ezra stood and walked to the cabin window. Outside, the lake shimmered in the afternoon light, so still it looked like glass. In that moment, he realized, he wasn't just dealing with petty HOA drama. He was the rightful steward of this land, and someone had tried to hijack it from him, and from everyone his uncle had intended to protect. He turned back to the phone. "Can you send me the full trust paperwork and titles?" "It's already in your inbox," Morris said. "And Ezra?" "Yeah? Whatever you're planning, make it loud." Ezra smiled for the first time in days. "Oh, I will." That evening, he printed out every page of the trust documentation, property titles, and zoning maps. He placed them into manila folders labeled "For the Board." He also prepared a separate folder marked "Sheriff's Office." Then, as the sky turned violet over Windermere, Ezra took a long walk down the path toward the old HOA clubhouse. Empty, except for security cameras and ego. He stood by the fence, looked up at the flag bearing the Windermere seal, and whispered to no one in particular, "You've been squatting on my land. Time to pay rent." The wind picked up through the trees like a quiet applause. Ezra didn't wait long. On Monday morning, he drove down the winding road into Windermere Village with 3 folders on the passenger seat and a calm, calculated fire in his chest. His old Jeep creaked as he parked right in front of the HOA building, a 2-story log cabin-style structure that looked more like a lodge than a governing office. He walked in without knocking. The receptionist, a young woman in her 20s with a forced smile, froze when she saw him. Do you have an appointment, sir?" "No," Ezra replied, placing a folder on her desk, "but Garland Thorne does. Tell him Ezra Whitlock is here, and it's urgent." Within minutes, Ezra was led into a sleek, overly modern boardroom that didn't match the rustic charm of the area. Garland sat at the head of the table, flanked by 3 board members, each wearing the same smug expressions as the day they served him the fake cease occupancy order. Ezra noticed that none of them had brought lawyers. They still thought they were in control. Garland crossed his arms. "You've got some nerve showing up here." Ezra didn't sit. He slid the folder across the table. "What I have is land ownership. 72% of Windermere Ridge, including this building, the lake access roads, and most of your so-called protected zones. This cabin you're sitting in right now, you're on my property." They blinked. Garland didn't even touch the folder. "That's ridiculous," Ezra smiled coolly. "My name is Ezra Whitlock. I'm the trustee and sole beneficiary of the Windermere Stewardship Fund. My uncle Lester Whitlock created it. You've been operating on land you don't own, issuing fake fines, forging easements, and intimidating residents into selling. Properties you then funneled into a Delaware holding company that you never realized I inherited." The silence in the room turned suffocating. One of the board members, a gray-haired woman with thick pearls around her neck, reached for the documents. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the notarized titles, the trust registry, and the original deed from 1957. "This can't be right," she whispered. We had lawyers." "You had fakes," Ezra said sharply, "and forged signatures. I have evidence of at least 4 transactions that went through without my authorization as trustee. That's fraud, by the way." Garland's face turned crimson. "You can't prove that in court." Ezra leaned forward, resting both palms on the polished wood table. "I don't have to. I already filed a report with the Sheriff's Department this morning. The real question is, how many residents were forced out under false pretenses? How many families lost their land because of your scam?" A second folder hit the table. Copies of complaints from former residents who had already contacted Ezra after seeing his anonymous blog post. Heartbreaking stories, threats, night visits, even drone surveillance. "You think you've been running a community," Ezra said, "but you've been running a racket, and you're done." Garland stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. "We can sue. We can freeze your assets." Ezra chuckled. "Good luck suing the person who owns the ground beneath your clubhouse." Then he reached into his bag and dropped the final folder on the table, this one containing official termination letters. "Effective immediately. Your access to all properties within the Windmere stewardship boundaries is revoked. That includes the roads you used to get here, the lodge, the trails. Your entire HOA authority is null and void, because it was never real to begin with. Nobody said a word. The power had shifted, and they knew it. Garland's mouth opened, but no words came. Ezra turned and walked out, the sound of his boots echoing off the wood-paneled walls like a gavel. Outside, the air felt different, lighter, brighter. He climbed back into his Jeep and drove straight to the sheriff's office to deliver the backup evidence. But before going in, he sat in the lot and exhaled slowly. They had no idea who he was when they tried to break him, but now they knew. And they had just learned that Ezra Whitlock wasn't a man to be pushed off his land. He was the one drawing the lines. The next morning, Ezra woke to the low whir of drones outside his cabin. At first, he thought it was just the wind shifting the pine boughs, but when he stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee, he saw them. 2 black quadcopters hovering just above the tree line, one drifting closer to his solar panels like it was inspecting them. He stared up at them, silent, unmoving. Then he turned back inside, calmly put down his mug, and flipped the main breaker, shutting off every non-essential system. Let them film the darkness. Within the hour, 2 Windmere County Code Enforcement trucks pulled into his drive. Ezra met them halfway up the gravel path. "Morning," he said, voice even. "Something I can help you with?" The older of the 2 men adjusted his belt. "We've had reports of zoning violations, fire hazards, improper waste disposal, noise complaints." Ezra raised an eyebrow. "Noise? I haven't turned on music in 2 days." The younger one avoided eye contact. "Also received anonymous tips that you may be illegally constructing additions to the cabin." Ezra crossed his arms. "You mean the insulation I patched inside my walls? Or the emergency satellite router?" The older officer shrugged. "We'll need to inspect the property." "No, you won't," Ezra said firmly. "You'll need a warrant." The 2 looked at each other, caught off guard. Ezra reached into his pocket and pulled out a laminated copy of the trust map and ownership documents. "This cabin and the land it sits on are part of a private trust with federal conservation protections. You're trespassing unless you have cause, and so far you've listed accusations with 0 evidence." The older officer hesitated, then muttered, "Fine, but we'll be back." Ezra didn't flinch. "Bring a judge next time." They drove off, tires spitting gravel behind them. Ezra stood there long after they disappeared, jaw tight. They were retaliating, clumsily, but still. And he knew where it came from. Garland Thorne and his collapsing empire. That evening, Ezra called Maura again. She picked up on the first ring. "They're escalating," he said. "Drones, fake violations trying to rattle me." Maura was quiet for a beat. "I'll fast-track the restraining order. And I've already started compiling the fraud case. 2 former board members reached out to me. They're willing to testify. One of them has emails from Garland threatening to make life hell for holdout residents." Ezra's lips curled into a bitter smile. "He's going to wish he never picked this fight." "I also contacted a journalist," Maura said. "You remember Thomas Beckett from the Greenwatch series? The guy who exposed that water rights scandal in Colorado? Yeah, he's interested in the story, real interested." Ezra's heart raced, not with fear, but purpose. "Let him come. I'll give him everything." Over the next 2 days, Ezra prepared. He scanned every document. He tagged every fraudulent transfer. He uploaded drone footage and video logs. He cataloged every strange visit and unwarranted accusation. By the time Beckett arrived, a wiry man with a steel-trap mind and a camera crew, Ezra had an entire archive ready. They spent hours recording interviews, walking the property, and reviewing the trust's purpose. Beckett's team captured the irony of it all, how the very people who claimed to preserve the land had been slowly poisoning its soul through intimidation and greed. By the time the documentary trailer dropped online 3 days later, the internet exploded. Ex-hacker turns the tables on corrupt HOA running land scam. Man inherits cabin, finds out he owns the whole town. Ezra's inbox flooded with messages. Former residents came forward, some with lawsuits already pending, others simply with stories and thanks. His anonymous blog was reposted on conservation forums, legal websites, and even state watchdog pages. The sheriff's office, under pressure, opened a formal investigation into Windermere Preservation Society's finances. And Garland? Garland tried one last time. That night, just before midnight, a pickup truck parked at the edge of Ezra's property line. A figure got out, marched toward the gate, and taped a final letter to the post. Ezra retrieved it in the morning. The letter was short, desperate. "You don't understand what you've done. This isn't just about land. You'll regret this." Ezra stared at it for a long time before setting it down, lighting a match, and watching it burn in his fire pit. They had tried to scare him off his own mountain, but all they'd done was wake him up, and now the whole country was watching. Ezra wasn't surprised when the subpoenas started rolling in. 2 days after the documentary went viral, the county courthouse issued official requests for Windermere Preservation Society's financial records, land transfer documentation, and all communications regarding member enforcement actions. The sheriff's department returned with a warrant, not for Ezra's cabin, but for the HOA's headquarters. News vans parked outside the HOA lodge like vultures circling roadkill. Garland Thorne didn't show his face. Rumors spread that he'd fled to Arizona. The board released a bland public statement denying all wrongdoing and accusing a disgruntled newcomer of manufacturing false narratives. But no one was buying it anymore. The damage was done and Ezra's evidence was airtight. Ezra, meanwhile, kept to his cabin. He was flooded with interview requests, podcasts, offers to turn the story into a book. He declined most of them. The attention wasn't the point. He hadn't come to Windermere Ridge for fame. He'd come for peace. But now that peace meant facing the war and finishing it properly, what haunted him most were the letters, real ones, handwritten in ink, arriving daily. A man named Curtis Holt described how his grandparents had been forced to sell their lakefront property for pennies on the dollar after the HOA fined them into submission. An older woman named Marilyn Rhodes wrote that she'd lost her retirement cabin after someone from the Preservation Committee threatened to report her son to immigration if they didn't vacate. Ezra read every letter. He responded to each one. One morning he found a small, wrinkled envelope slipped under his front door. No return address. Inside was a note written in a trembling hand. They took my land, but they couldn't take the memories. If you bring it back, I'll die knowing it wasn't all lost. W.R. Ezra held the note for a long time, his thumb brushing the initials. That day he began drafting a new plan. Not just to dissolve the HOA or expose the fraud, but to rebuild, to restore what had been stolen. He spent hours on the phone with Maura and Thomas Beckett. Together they began organizing a land trust cooperative, a way to return parcels to their rightful owners or their families, to preserve the lake as a shared refuge, and to ensure no one could ever use fake power to control it again. He opened a legal petition to formally reclaim the parcels sold without authorization through the Windermere Stewardship Fund. He also set up a restitution fund using what remained of his uncle's estate. Ezra had never needed the money, and now he knew exactly what it was meant for. But not everyone was thrilled. Late one night, Ezra heard tires on gravel. He peered through the window to see headlights facing his cabin. Someone stood outside the vehicle, a tall man in a dark coat just beyond the reach of the porch light. Ezra stepped out, unarmed but unafraid. "Garland?" he called out into the dark. No response. Just a long pause. Then the man turned, got back into the truck, and drove off into the trees. Ezra watched until the lights disappeared. The next morning, a sheriff's deputy stopped by with an update. Garland Thorne had been arrested in a nearby county. He'd been caught trying to transfer trust assets using forged documents under a fake name. They had him. Ezra sat down on the cabin steps, his dog lying at his feet, the lake stretching out before him like silver glass. For the first time in weeks, there was no tension in his chest, no drones overhead, no threats taped to the fence. The land was still, silent, safe, and it finally felt like it belonged again. Not just to him, but to everyone who had ever loved it. He knew it wasn't over. There were still lawsuits to win, lands to return, and lives to help rebuild. But the foundation had shifted, and this time it was real. Spring arrived slowly in Timberfall Ridge. The lake thawed under golden sunlight, the snow gave way to sprouting wildflowers, and Ezra finally left his cabin without that tight, invisible pressure in his chest. For the first time since he moved in, the air felt like it belonged to everyone again. The county officially dissolved the Windermere Preservation Society. Their assets were frozen, their board disbanded, and Garland Thorne remained in custody, now facing multiple charges: fraud, harassment, unlawful land seizure, and forgery. He'd made a deal with prosecutors to name others involved in exchange for leniency, but Ezra didn't care about punishment anymore. Justice was already happening, not in prison bars, but in the rebuilding. Ezra turned his focus fully to the Windermere Community Land Trust. With Maura's help, they launched a website with simple instructions. If you or your family had ever lived on Windermere Ridge and lost property under HOA pressure, you could file a claim. The submissions poured in. Ezra read every single one, and with a small team of legal volunteers and local historians, they verified deeds, traced records, and began offering return agreements or shared ownership rights through the trust. The first cabin returned belonged to the Rhodes family. Marilyn's granddaughter Talia had driven up with her own children and burst into tears when she stepped onto the old porch. Ezra handed her the keys personally. "No strings," she whispered. Ezra shook his head. "This land was always yours. I'm just the one holding it until you're ready to come home." Word spread faster than he expected. More families came. Some returned to rebuild. Others just wanted closure. Ezra turned the original HOA lodge into a community center, stripping down the corporate plaques and replacing them with bookshelves, photos of the land's history, and a large wooden sign carved by a local artisan that read, "The Land Remembers." The porch of Ezra's cabin became a gathering place. People left jars of honey, fresh bread, letters, thank you notes. Sometimes strangers knocked on the door just to shake his hand. He never got used to it. One afternoon he was walking near the lake when a teenage girl ran up to him. She had a spiral notebook under one arm and wore a hoodie 2 sizes too big. "Mr. Whitlock?" she asked breathlessly. He turned. "Yes?" She opened the notebook and showed him a pencil sketch. It was of the lake, drawn from the exact angle where they stood. The trees, the water, the birds in the sky. It was stunning. "My dad used to bring me here when I was little," she said. "We lost our cabin 5 years ago. I don't know if we'll ever get it back, but thank you for trying." Ezra swallowed. He couldn't speak for a moment. Then he asked, "What's your name?" "Riley." He looked down at the sketch again. "Riley, would you let me hang this in the new lodge?" Her face lit up. "Really? Really? And if you ever want to come back here to draw, you don't need permission. You belong here." Later that night, Ezra sat alone on the cabin porch, the sketch framed and resting beside him. He stared at the water and thought of his Uncle Lester, who had quietly, patiently protected this place for decades. Ezra hadn't known the full weight of the legacy he'd inherited. Not until now. What Garland and his board had tried to do wasn't just about money. It was erasure. They wanted to strip people of place, of memory, of dignity. But the land remembered, and now so did the people. The trust was growing. Ezra had plans to turn parts of the preserved area into educational trails, retreats for veterans, even open artist residencies. Not one part of the forest would be sold. Every tree would remain rooted where it belonged, just like the people. The war was almost over, but the rebuilding, it was just beginning. The grand reopening of Windermere Ridge came on the first Saturday of June. A soft breeze rolled off the lake, warm sunlight filtered through the birch trees, and families who hadn't stepped foot here in years began arriving one by one, some with tears already forming before they even left their cars. Others came with kids in tow, dogs barking happily, baskets of food, old photographs tucked under their arms. Ezra stood at the edge of the former HOA clubhouse, now the Windermere Lodge, watching it all unfold like a scene from a life he never thought he'd live. The community center had been transformed. Where there were once walls of fake awards and policy posters, there were now murals painted by children, displays of handwritten stories from displaced families, and maps showing how much of the land had been reclaimed. A bonfire pit had been built near the lake's edge. A handmade bench stood beneath the largest oak tree, with a plaque that read, "In honor of those who never got the chance to come back, the land remembers them too." Dennis Croft, the elderly neighbor who had first warned Ezra about the HOA, arrived with a slow but determined walk, his weathered hand gripping Ezra's shoulder as he said, "You didn't just save land, son. You gave people their roots back." Ezra smiled. "I just followed what was already planted." The ceremony began with no speeches, just a simple gesture. Ezra walked up to the front steps of the lodge, holding the original wooden sign his uncle had once nailed above the old cabin. Burned into the wood were the words, "Whitlock Cabin, established Airata Torairata Aimbati Yeru." He held it high, then handed it to a girl in the crowd, Riley, the teenager who had shown him her lake sketch weeks earlier. She stepped forward, tears in her eyes, and together they mounted it above the new entrance. The crowd clapped, but not loudly. It felt more like reverence than celebration. Later in the afternoon, as music played and children splashed in the lake, Ezra walked alone along the edge of the property. The air smelled of pine, smoke, and possibility. He paused at the ridge overlooking the whole basin, the spot where his uncle used to sit and watch the sun dip low. In that moment, Ezra felt something deep in his chest, a quiet heaviness lifting that he hadn't even realized was still there. He had come to the cabin to escape, to hide, to grieve a life that had burned him out. But instead, he had been called to something bigger. He had unearthed a war, and instead of retreating, he stood his ground, not with fists, but with truth. And now the land was not just his to defend. It was everyone's to share. Behind him, someone called his name. It was Mora, holding a glass of lemonade, grinning. "We've got reporters asking when the second chapter of the story comes out." Ezra laughed. "Tell them they'll have to write it themselves. I'm retired." "You say that every time." He took the lemonade, looked back over the people dancing, hugging, and returning to what was once stolen from them. "This time I mean it," he said. The camera crews eventually left. The legal paperwork faded into file cabinets. The news cycle moved on. But Windermere Ridge didn't. It remained, honest, protected, free. And at the center of it all stood a quiet cabin beneath the trees, a man on the porch sipping coffee, and a land no longer afraid to remember what it was always meant to be. In my opinion, the ending of this story is not just satisfying, it's deeply restorative. What began as a personal search for peace turned into a quiet revolution against injustice. Ezra didn't seek conflict, but when he was pushed, he responded not with vengeance or violence, but with intelligence, truth, and integrity. That, to me, is real power. The final chapter showed that true ownership isn't about titles or fences. It's about stewardship, memory, and community. Ezra didn't just win. He healed something that had been broken for years. He honored the legacy of his uncle not by hoarding the land, but by opening it up to those who had lost everything. What makes this ending truly powerful is that it doesn't rely on a dramatic showdown or revenge fantasy. Instead, it quietly asserts that justice, when rooted in compassion, has a ripple effect. Ezra didn't become a hero in the traditional sense. He became something better, a restorer of dignity, a protector of belonging, and a symbol of what happens when good people stop running and start standing. It's a reminder that sometimes the land doesn't need to be conquered. It just needs someone brave enough to remember who it was meant for.